Alright, January day 11, let's take a look under the hood here. Let's look at the drums first. I'll just play a section that's got all the drums happening in it. Alright, so we got a bunch of layers to this thing. Let's just go through them from the bottom up. First we have the kick. So most of these drums have lots of processing on them. I wanted to make them like as punchy as possible. So I had a sampler instrument with the original kick. This again is the Oliver Lindrum kick. On that I've got a gated room with only like 24 thousandths of a second of reverb on it. And that just makes it a little bit bigger and a little bit wider, which I thought was really nice. Then I have OTT on it after at 32% to pull out that reverb. Camel Crusher British Clean to distort it a little bit. Transient Designer, I'm pulling the sustain down a lot because there was a little bit of tail on it. And I'm pushing the attack up a lot. And then I've got a second Transient Designer with no attack. And it pulls down the sustain even more, and that just gives it like a lot of attack right off the start. And then pretty much no tail on it at all. So let's just listen and see what that kick sounds like with these plugins turned on gradually. So here's the kick on its own. Here it is with Space Designer. It's a little bit wider. It's hard to tell. OTT, Camel Crusher, makes it a lot bigger. And then the Transient Designers are going to make it a lot punchier. Yes. And then I exported that because I had a lot of kicks happening quickly, in quick succession, and when you have a Transient Designer on something, it's looking for audio transients. And if you have a bunch of kicks too close together, then it will only perceive the first transient. So I bounced one kick to audio with the Transient Designer. And then we've got that here, and I just put two more Transient Designers on it, pulling the release down because there was still too much release for me. And then that's sent to bus 1, which is my side chain. So we got the kick. Then we have the snare. Snare is the Lindrum. We have channel EQ cutting off the lows at 90 hertz. We have Space Designer doing a similar thing, 77 thousandths of a second. Makes it a little bit wider. OTT to pull it up, 33%. Camel Crusher, Transient Designers. It's a really similar chain. And that was just like, I wanted these drums to be as punchy as possible and to take up as little space as possible so that I could have lots of layers of stuff. And this is also being sent to bus 1, and it's basically sidechaining just like the kick would. And the reason for that is because with this beat, the snare has a lot of the power of the beat because there's not a kick happening underneath it on the 2s and the 4s. And so if I wanted the sidechain to pulse on every beat, then the snare has to hit it as well. And the kick in the snare sounds like this. Yeah, so that's the kick in the snare. On that, we've got a clap. Clap is just sample delay to make it wider, 513 samples. I always go to that number for no good reason. And American Crunch to make it brighter and distorted. Real nice. We start to add hi-hats to it. Hi-hat has EQ, Camel Crusher, a couple Transient Designers, and a compressor. Compressor is the sidechain compressor from the kick so that the hi-hat is less obvious and it pulses with the beat. Right, and so the hi-hat just happens on the beats to add a little bit more emphasis at the start, and then we're going to add an 8th note in between on the hi-hat in a bit, and also 16th notes in between that. I have a J-Lin sample pack. It could be any hi-hat. I use different hi-hats sometimes, but like an open hi-hat on the first beat usually of a bar, just for like frequency range, emphasis, and what do we have on that? Channel EQ, Camel Crusher, OTT, Transient Designer, LFO tool, because I wanted it to feel like it was being crushed a little bit by a sidechain right off the beat and kind of opening up. It was just the feel I was looking for. I wanted to kind of like feel like it was drawn out and growing, like a tss, and you can hear, like, I'll turn off that LFO tool. It's a lot right off the bat, but feels a lot more controlled, and I like that sound more. I've got an open hi-hat in the first bar, I think on the third beat. Yeah, on the end of 3. We have shaker. We appear to have another hi-hat here. Ah yes, the 16th note's at the end of the second bar. Right, to that, we're going to add another layer of hi-hats, doing 16th notes. And you can see from the arrangement here that it starts out with just the kick and snare and the open hi-hat off the start, and the 16th note hi-hats at the end of every second bar, and then we start to add an open hi-hat, we start to add a shaker and another hi-hat, doing just the quarter notes, then we add 16th notes, and then that persists for what appears to be about 12 bars. And that's the drums. Now all of the drums are being sent to a group first off, and then that group is being sent to 2 buses. Bus 9, which has the Audio Damage Rough Rider on it. I put this on all my drums, NY compression setting, nothing to it. I think this is a free plugin. I've been using this on my drums since 2014, all the time. And it's just like, I mean, it's just parallel compression. There's nothing to it. There's lots of parallel compressors, but I like this one. It's served me well. I remember when I first discovered parallel compression and started using this compressor, it was immediately like, ah, yes, my drums sound okay now. Because before that, my drums sounded like garbage. And then they're also being sent to bus 2, which is a reverb. Just a small wet room reverb, that Nicki Minaj one. I have a channel EQ on it. Now, because all the drums are being sent to this, I'm cutting off the lows, so I'm not getting lots of reverb from the kick. I already have the kick being sent to, I already have the reverb on the kick with a little bit of gated room on it. And then I'm cutting everything off at 5K, because when you've got hi-hats and stuff, it can create a lot of really bright reverb, which is not something I want. It's distracting, because then in the background of your song all the time, you've got like a from your hi-hat sound, which is not great. Directional mixer, something like wider or whatever, to make the reverb a little bit wider so it's not crowding up the middle of your mix. Heavy sidechain from the kick, so that it's pulsing and getting out of the way. Notice that I've got a reverb on it, and then after it I've got 3 plugins to like get the reverb out of the way, because I want the reverb in there, but it's something that's really supposed to be like felt and not heard. So EQ gets it out of the way in a frequency range, directional mixer gets it out of the way in the stereo field, compressor gets it out of the way dynamically, and then I have an OTT to pull it up a little bit, because the reverbs can be like really dark and easy to get lost, and so the OTT just brings it up a little bit. But you know, you just mess with the settings until it sounds the way you want it to sound. But those are the tricks that I employ to get my reverb the way I want it to sound. All right, so we've got the drums. Let's look at the bass here. So I've got 3 channels of bass here. I've got a high, a low. These are just doubles. One is an octave higher. And I've got a sub. Notice on the low and the high, I've got a couple of plugins. I've got EQs, obviously. On the low one, I'm cutting all the frequencies off at 100. It's arbitrary. Just sounded right, I guess. And then on the high one, I'm cutting off higher at 255, because I don't want too many low frequencies being crowded. I've got a sub just for like the lowest low frequencies, and I actually I cut everything off at 30 hertz. The kick is the only thing that I'll ever not EQ the lowest frequencies off of. And I probably could afford to. Maybe I'm supposed to, but I do cut them off the sub, because the sub is more of like a tonal element, and it takes up space and time in the mix and the arrangement. But the kick is more of like I want as much impact from it as I can get. And so I feel like even though 30 hertz is like, you don't really need it, I leave it anyway. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. Whatever. And then the bass group has a lot more processing on it. So I have a channel EQ. Oh, there it is. So I have a channel EQ cutting everything off at 30 hertz anyway. That's nice. I have a space designer. Same thing, 16 thousandths of a second of reverb here, just to widen up the bass a little bit, give it a little bit more time and presence so it comes through more. OTT pulls up that reverb. Camel Crusher distorts the whole thing. British Clean, this is just standard British Clean. Transient Designer for a tiny bit more punch and a little bit less sustain. So it's a real punchy bass is what I'm looking for here. Now, to get it out of the way and make it pulse and get that beat across, I have an LFO tool here doing a fake sidechain. I have Track Spacer cutting off the low frequencies below 672 hertz. When the kick hits, it's like a sidechain EQ. And then I've also got a compressor. These three things together are basically doing the same thing in different ways. And I always like to combine different sidechain combination, different sidechain plugins doing different ways. Like the LFO tool is just like drawing a volume automation line. And Track Spacer is getting rid of the lows when the kick hits in an EQ, in a frequency range way. And then compressor is doing everything in a dynamic way, compressing it when the kick hits. And all these are basically set to get the bass out of the way in a different way, so that it's not too much of one effect, and that way you feel that it's being ducked, but in a way that's not as obvious as any one of these three tools being used on its own. So I always like to combine multiple sidechain methods on the same tracks, and that goes to the whole bass groups. So actually, let's turn these three plugins off and just hear the kick and bass on their own. Now let's turn them on and see if we can hear a difference at all. Yeah, so listen especially on the first beat. I'll turn them off again. Not very dynamic, but if we turn them on, listen to the first beat again. So those are really being ducked. And so it feels a bit more dynamic. It feels a bit more like there's interaction between the kick and the bass. And it also feels like the drums or the beat, which is a really critical element in any piece of music like this. The beat really is one of the most important things. In fact, I would argue in this song, it's the most important thing, because usually the beat would only be second to the vocal. You want the vocal to come through, right? So, because that's the part that your mind follows closest. But the beat is for your lizard brain. And so you want that beat to shine through. Yeah, that's how that sounds. All right, and then everything else is like synths, melodies, chords, ambience, effects. We've got this wiggle sound, which I built in Massive. And this is just LFO5 here on 16th notes, wiggling pitch of oscillator 1, while envelope 1 with a long attack slowly turns the amp down and slowly turns the pitch down by 60 semitones. And so what you have is a note that's basically falling in pitch, while at the same time, every 16th note flying up and down, that'd be like 28 semitones, 14 in either direction. Yeah, so you can hear that it's falling. You can hear that it's like sliding up and down in pitch. And then on top of that, channel EQ to cut off a bunch of the lows, sample delay to make it wider, and a compressor so that you feel the impact of the kick on it. We've got this sound, which is just supposed to be like a dystopian sci-fi kind of like siren-y in the distance kind of sound. And that's built in Massive. you could probably tell what's on it. It's going to be like what? A low pass filter, that makes sense. Pitch fallen by 6 semitones, dimension expander. It's a really simple sound, but then on top of that, I've got Camel Crusher and Space Design, and the reverb is up, so the wet reverb is up a little bit, and the dry is all the way down, so you're only getting reverb. And then I exported that sound to audio and cut it on the third beat, which is the second snare of that bar, so that it stops real hard when the snare hits, right, and doesn't continue to take up space in the mix there, because I was trying to keep everything fairly tight. Oh, this is a cool sound. This is a sound that I made massive. Let's take a look at the MIDI for that. This is pretty random pentatonic MIDI. And I was kind of just hitting random notes, and then I also have these longer notes. And what is going on here is I wanted to have a chord that was sort of stabbing on 16th notes, and so I built that. We've got a fairly punchy, you can see that there's a mix between these two, fairly punchy attack happening at 16th notes. And I've mixed in this really sharp decay here to make it a little bit punchier even. And that's on a low pass filter and on the amp. And then also we've got a long attack on envelope 1, which is being routed to pitch so that it's falling as the note sustains. So the longer the note lasts, the more the pitch falls. And this was a chord idea that I wanted to have something fairly simple and stabbing. And then I wanted it to be a little more interesting and complex, so I made the pitch fall as the note sustains. And that actually is meant to mirror this dystopian sound effect here. I went for a pitch falling thing. I don't know. I thought it sounded cool and sickly, sort of. Dystopian, futuristic world. We've got a melody here, which is a serum patch. Oh yeah, this is just some preset that I scrolled through and then gave it a bunch more attack and less sustain and turned the reverb off and stuff. There's Camel Crusher on this, Annihilate setting. There's an echo with a half note, 50% wet. And then there's an LFO tool to give it some pulse. Yeah. And this has a lot of character. Melodically, because it's chromatic, so it goes outside the key really quickly. Yeah, we've got a hard bass, which is another serum patch. Yeah, so this is just like FM from B. There's just two saws here. FM from B to make it a little bit more hard and synthetic sounding. We've got some noise. We've got some downsample distortion, and that gives it some high frequency sound. Here, actually, I'll A-B this for y'all. Let's turn the noise off. Let's turn the distortion off. And let's turn it back on. Yeah, so it's a little bit more high frequency noise, and it makes it a lot more aggressive sounding. Camel Crusher, OTT, wider, make it sound wider. Compressor and 2 LFO tools. Sometimes if I have the LFO tool setting that I like, but it's already at 100%, I'll just double it. Oh yeah, this one's at 100% too. And then both of them just amplify the effect. Rather than try to draw the shape again, if I like the shape but it's not enough, I'll just double the plug-in because I have the CPU power for that. Yeah. What other sounds are there? Ah, yes, there's one more sound. There's one more different sound. What is this? So this was originally just a chord. Just a solid pad chord. But what I've done with it, Camel Crusher wider, a tremolo effect with the face at the 50, you can see they're almost the same shape. So rather than doing like a left-right, which would be like this, when one side gets louder, the other gets quieter. So it sounds like it's moving from side to side. We have it like this, which is nearly the same. And then it gives you the impression in headphones of it sort of moving around your head, because these two are basically just like almost synced up, but not quite. And so it's almost like a motion blur or something. It sounds like it's moving quickly around your head in a circle. And then we've got a couple of LFO tools, and then we've got from the kick here. And this chord And then I exported it and put a compressor on it from the kick and sent it to a couple of reverbs, or rather a couple of echoes. And you can see on the echoes here, I've drawn automation lines because I wanted some hard stops in the chord, so I'd mute the chord and then also mute the effect. And you can hear what that sounded like. Yeah, and so with the track that sounds like this. And that's it, that's the whole track. So there's a lot of processing on this one, just to make everything punchy and sit together well. I don't usually put this much effort into like producing the Januaries, but that's kind of what this one was about. So anyway, there you go, look under the hood, January Day Left.